Welcome, dear subscribers and curious listeners of my channel. J.K. Rowling came up with an intriguing system of house rivalry in Harry Potter, the point system. It was meant not only to encourage students to work for the common good, but also to instill a sense of collective responsibility. Every action you take reflects on your entire house. In practice, however, things were much murkier. The rules for awarding and deducting points were never clearly defined in the books. Snape could strip points purely out of personal bias, while Dumbledore could casually hand Gryffindor hundreds at the end of the year. That's why I suggest we don't dwell on the mechanics of this system, but instead revisit some of the most absurd and contradictory moments connected to points being lost or awarded. Enjoy the video. Number 1. Malfoy and the Dementors. One of the most famous incidents happened during Quidditch practice. Malfoy and his cronies, Crabbe, Goyle, and even team captain Flint came up with the brilliant idea of dressing in black cloaks and pretending to be dementors in order to knock Harry off his broom. But their plan flopped. McGonagall caught the four of them stumbling around the field in their cloaks, and her fury was terrifying. "A cowardly and disgraceful attempt to sabotage Gryffindor's seeker," she shouted. 50 points from Slytherin. Number 2. Ron and the Crocodile Heart. During potions, Malfoy mocked Harry by pretending to be a Dementor. Ron snapped and hurled a huge crocodile heart at him. The scene itself was hilarious, but Snape, of course, never missed a chance to punish Gryffindor. "Minus 50 points, he announced coldly. What's interesting is that the exact same penalty was given to Harry, Hermione, and Neville in Philosopher's Stone for sneaking around the castle at night. Which means Snape equated Ron's little outburst with one of the most serious breaches of school rules. Number 3. Ron's sarcasm. Sometimes Ron managed to get Gryffindor into trouble with nothing more than his sense of humour. In a defence against the dark arts lesson about inferi, Snape mocked Harry, and Ron decided to step in. "If we meet one in a dark alley," he said, "we just have to check if it's solid or see-through. Asking, 'Excuse me, are you by any chance a soul imprint?' probably won't work." The class laughed, but Snape instantly killed the fun. Minus 10 points from Gryffindor. Number 4. McGonagall and Harry's stubbornness. Even strict but fair, McGonagall sometimes deducted points from her own students. In 5th year, Harry kept clashing with Umbridge, and this worried his head of house. "Potter, you must learn to control yourself," she said. "You're heading straight for trouble. 5 points from Gryffindor." Even she understood. Sometimes Harry was his own worst enemy. Number 5. The Weasley twins and Montague. Fred and George Weasley, Hogwarts legends, masters of pranks and chaos. In Order of the Phoenix, when Umbridge created the Inquisitorial Squad, Slytherins were granted the power to deduct points from other students. Naturally, they abused it. Malfoy docked 50 points from Gryffindor, and Montague tried to follow his example, but the twins were faster. They shoved him headfirst into the vanishing cabinet. His punishment turned out to be far worse than any lost points. Number 6. Harry and Snape. And finally, a case where no points were at stake, but punishment still came. During a lesson on nonverbal spells, Harry, frustrated, shouted, "Protego!" "We are practicing silently today, Potter," Snape reminded him. "Yes, sir." "There's no need to call me sir, Professor," Harry shot back. The classroom fell silent. Hermione gasped, and Ron and Dean struggled to keep from laughing. This time, no points were lost, but Harry's reputation among his friends only grew. Number 7. Hermione and the toothy response. Hermione Granger's slap across Draco Malfoy's face in Prisoner of Azkaban remains one of the most satisfying moments in the series. Malfoy had taunted Harry and Ron yet again, mocking their every move with his sneering grin. Hermione, usually the picture of control, suddenly snapped. Rowling describes it with sharp clarity. Hermione raised her hand and slapped Malfoy hard across the face. The classroom froze, and then, almost instantly, the Gryffindors erupted in applause. For once, Someone had silenced Malfoy's cruelty. But the celebration was short-lived. When the matter reached Professor Snape, his judgment was as predictable as it was unfair. He ignored Malfoy's constant stream of insults and targeted Hermione instead. Gryffindor lost points for what Snape called violent behavior, as though defending friends from relentless abuse was a greater offense than the abuse itself. The imbalance was striking. Malfoy's words carried no consequences, but Hermione's single act of defiance cost her entire house. Number 8. Harry and the toffee. The toffee was one of Fred and George Weasley's most outrageous inventions. The sweet caused a person's tongue to swell to grotesque proportions, leaving them unable to speak properly. Harry had first heard of it at the Quidditch World Cup, when the twins proudly explained their experiments. Later, back at Hogwarts, he ended up trying one himself. His tongue ballooned, filling his mouth, and the scene was more comic than dangerous. Yet when the story reached Professor Snape, he found a way to turn the prank into another attack on Gryffindor. Snape's reaction was swift and one-sided. Instead of blaming Fred and George, the actual creators of the toffee, he deducted points from Harry. The chosen one ought to keep away from idiotic amusements, he sneered, treating Harry not as a victim, but as a reckless accomplice. It was a punishment that made no logical sense. Harry hadn't brewed the sweet or handed it out. He had simply been caught in the twins' mischief. The moment showed again how fragile the fairness of the point system was. Gryffindor's rubies fell because of an invention by Fred and George, yet the one who suffered in the books was Harry. What should have been a harmless joke among friends turned into another example of Snape twisting the rules to fit his bias. Justice was never the goal. The points became a weapon, and Harry was the easy target. Number 9, Neville and the forgotten password. Neville Longbottom's trouble with passwords became one of his most humiliating moments in Philosopher's Stone. He had a habit of forgetting the ever-changing words that guarded the entrance to Gryffindor Tower. One night, under the influence of Polyjuice Potion, Crabbe and Goyle, disguised as Gryffindor students, managed to slip past him. Neville, confused and unsure, let them through. His mistake opened the door not just to intruders, but to ridicule from his housemates. The response from the professors was harsh. Instead of a calm reminder or some understanding of Neville's well-known memory struggles, the punishment was immediate. Points were deducted from Gryffindor. Snape and others made it clear that the whole house would pay for Neville's lapse. The book describes how devastating it was for him. Neville looked as though he had been struck by a heavy blow. For a boy already lacking confidence, the penalty was crushing. What makes the situation feel so unjust is the context. Neville was not careless out of arrogance. He was simply forgetful, a trait everyone knew. Allowing Crabbe and Goyle in was a mistake, but it hardly deserved collective punishment. Gryffindor's hourglass lost rubies once again, and the house's frustration landed squarely on Neville's shoulders. Even Hermione, normally his defender, could not stop the decision. This incident showed how the point system punished weakness instead of teaching responsibility. Neville needed guidance and encouragement, but what he received was humiliation and blame. Instead of building him up, Hogwarts made him a scapegoat, and Gryffindor was left to resent him for a mistake any child in his position could have made. The rules did not make the school safer. They only made Neville feel smaller. Number 10. Ron and the flying car. Ron Weasley's most reckless moment came at the start of Chamber of Secrets. He and Harry had missed the train to Hogwarts and decided the only solution was to fly Arthur Weasley's enchanted Ford Anglia all the way to Scotland. They soared above the countryside, invisible to no one, and nearly crashed into the Hogwarts Express. When they finally arrived, battered and late, the car itself seemed furious, throwing them out before disappearing into the forbidden forest. The danger of their stunt was obvious. They had been seen by Muggles, violated the International Statute of Secrecy, and put their lives at risk. Professor McGonagall's anger was icy. "You might have been seen! You mustn't be seen!" she scolded, her voice trembling with fury. Punishment came swiftly. Points were taken from Gryffindor, and both boys were given detention. Yet in light of what they had done, the penalty seemed strangely light. The absurdity is in the logic of the punishment. For a crime that nearly exposed the entire wizarding world, the main consequence was the loss of house points. The rest of Gryffindor suffered for Ron and Harry's foolish decision. The boys became infamous overnight, and the laughter of Slytherin rang through the great hall as the rubies vanished from the hourglass. This moment exposes how inconsistent the system truly was. For small acts like wandering the corridors at night, the punishment had been the same, dozens of points lost. But when two students risked breaking the most sacred law of the wizarding world, the consequence was not expulsion or lasting discipline, but just another drop in Gryffindor's total. The point system reduced even the gravest offences to numbers, stripping them of their real weight. Number 11, Harry and the Library. The forbidden section of the library was a temptation Harry Potter could not resist. He needed answers about Nicholas Flamel, and the only place they could be found was behind that rope barrier. One night, under the cover of his invisibility cloak, Harry crept into the rows of dusty books. He opened one, and the text screamed. The book screamed! A high, ear-splitting, blood-curdling shriek. Filch appeared almost immediately, and Harry barely escaped, but the consequence was predictable. Points were taken from Gryffindor. This wasn't the first time. Each attempt Harry made to uncover the truth was met with the same result. Sneaking into the library meant punishment, even if his intentions were good. The irony was sharp. Harry was searching for the stone to protect the school, but the system treated him like a petty rule-breaker. Every time, rubies dropped from Gryffindor's hourglass, and the rest of the house paid the price for his curiosity. What makes the situation feel unfair is the double standard. When Draco Malfoy or other Slytherins were caught breaking rules, the punishments were softer. A sharp word, a glare, but rarely the loss of points. Yet with Harry, the scale of discipline shifted dramatically. He was not just corrected, his entire house suffered. In the eyes of the students, this looked less like justice and more like favoritism. The library scenes show how fragile the point system was. The rules were the same for all, but the punishments were not. For Gryffindor, the smallest misstep meant losing ground in the House Cup. For others, especially Slytherins, the same act often went ignored. The message to Harry was clear. Courage and curiosity were dangerous, and the system would never reward him for seeking the truth. Number 12, Harry and the First Year's Broomsticks. Harry's first flight on a broomstick is one of the most famous moments in Philosopher's Stone. Malfoy had stolen Neville's remembrall and tossed it high into the air. Without hesitation, Harry kicked off the ground and soared upward. The scene is described with vivid energy. Harry kicked hard, and the broom jumped off the ground. He rose higher and higher, chasing after the glittering ball. It was his first real taste of flying, and he caught the remembrall with a natural grace that left the other students stunned. But, instead of praise, Harry was punished. Madam Hooch had already warned the class not to move, and technically Harry broke that rule. Still, his actions were heroic. He retrieved Neville's possession and humiliated Malfoy in the process. Snape, however, wasted no time in docking points from Gryffindor. To him, this was not bravery, but insolence. "You could have broken your neck," was the general warning, followed by a cold deduction from the hourglass. The punishment made the whole event feel less like triumph and more like a crime. The irony came only moments later. Professor McGonagall had witnessed Harry's daring catch and saw something no one else did: talent. Instead of scolding him, she marched him directly to Oliver Wood and announced, "This boy's a natural. I found you a seeker." What Snape had treated as reckless disobedience, McGonagall saw as the beginning of greatness, the same act, two completely opposite judgments. This contradiction exposes how inconsistent the points system truly was. For one teacher, Harry deserved punishment. For another, he deserved glory and a place on the Quidditch team. The rules seemed to bend depending on who was watching, and once again, Gryffindor's score was left at the mercy of a professor's personal opinion rather than any real sense of fairness. Number 13, Hermione and the Nightly Escapade. In Philosopher's Stone, the night adventure of Harry, Ron, and Hermione turned into one of the most infamous punishments in Hogwarts history. They had followed Draco Malfoy through the castle, convinced he was up to something. It was reckless, yes, but far from life-threatening. They were caught wandering the halls after hours, and the punishment was swift. Each of them lost 50 points, not a warning, not detention, 50 points each. The Gryffindor hourglass bled rubies like a waterfall, and their house collapsed to the bottom of the standings. The injustice of it was striking. These were 11-year-olds who had gone for a walk, not students caught practicing dark magic. Yet the scale of the penalty made it feel like a crime. Rowling even describes the stunned reaction. Gryffindor had lost 150 points in one night. It was the biggest blow anyone could remember. Suddenly the house that had been celebrated as brave and noble became a school-wide disgrace. The punishment changed the atmosphere for Harry and his friends. Classmates turned their backs, whispering whenever they passed. Neville Longbottom, who had been dragged into the escapade, also paid the price with the same deduction. One mistake had branded them all as pariahs. Even Ravenclaws and Hufflepuffs were laughing at them, the text says, showing how quickly respect shifted to scorn. The sense of isolation was overwhelming. This moment reveals how unbalanced the point system really was. The children's mistake was foolish, but it hardly justified such devastation to their house's reputation. Instead of teaching them caution, the punishment created bitterness and humiliation. It showed that at Hogwarts, discipline was less about justice and more about dramatic gestures, and in the middle of it all stood Harry, Ron, and Hermione, branded as the ones who had single-handedly sunk Gryffindor. Number 14, Sirius and for Harry. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, the oppressive presence of Dolores Umbridge created a strange distortion of what Hogwarts was meant to be. The school had always been a place where rules were strict, but ultimately just, where punishment carried a certain logic, and where students believed, even grudgingly, that discipline was meant to teach rather than to break. Yet under Umbridge, this delicate balance collapsed. Her power was built on humiliation, her punishments on fear, and her most trivial sanctions turned into tools of psychological pressure. One of the clearest examples of this was the way she wielded the faculty of deducting house points. Harry Potter, already caught in the unbearable tension of his connection to Voldemort, found himself further punished not for mischief or arrogance, but for reaching out to the only person who gave him guidance, his godfather, Sirius Black. The mechanics of the point system had always seemed like a childlike game, rubies spilling into the hourglass for Gryffindor victories, emeralds for Slytherin cunning, sapphires for Ravenclaw brilliance, and topaz for Hufflepuff loyalty. Yet Umbridge transformed this familiar system into a weapon. When Harry attempted to communicate with Sirius, driven not by reckless adventure but by fear of the strange dreams that linked him to Voldemort's mind, Umbridge immediately found a way to convert this natural instinct for safety into guilt. She declared that such unsanctioned correspondence endangered the school. What could have been understood as the cry of a boy searching for mentorship became rebranded as sabotage against authority, and every deduction of 10 or 20 points meant not just punishment, but public shaming before his peers. The irony was bitter. For years, Harry had been scolded for secrecy, for withholding information from teachers or refusing to rely on adults. In the 5th book, he made the deliberate choice to seek guidance from someone older and wiser, from Sirius, who not only was his godfather but also a member of the Order of the Phoenix. Yet this responsible step was twisted into rebellion. As the text notes, Umbridge would inspect all incoming and outgoing owl post and any attempt to circumvent her. Surveillance was treated as a crime. Harry's desperate search for counsel was marked by the cruel voice of Umbridge announcing 10 points from Gryffindor for unsanctioned communication. His peers would see the gems vanish from their hourglass, and in that single moment the personal struggle of one boy became the collective punishment of an entire house. This is where the injustice of the system revealed itself most vividly. The subtraction of points no longer reflected actual wrongdoing. Instead, it was a public theatre designed to break down solidarity. Students began to look at Harry with frustration, some whispering that his actions cost them the lead in the House Cup. A punishment meant to correct was instead a wedge, forcing him into greater isolation. The narrative makes it clear that Harry was not guilty of frivolous mischief. He was reaching out because Voldemort was penetrating his dreams, showing him visions of corridors, doors, and terrible traps. His instincts were not wrong. The only person who seemed to take him seriously was Sirius. Yet every attempt to keep this lifeline alive was marked by the tolling sound of points lost, as if each ruby sucked away from the hourglass was another nail hammered into his sense of belonging. The deeper cruelty lay in how these punishments stripped meaning from the house point system itself. Once upon a time, when Professor McGonagall deducted 5 points for a late arrival, or Snape punished Gryffindor with 10 points for cheek, the punishment might have felt biased, but it still reflected a concrete action. With Umbridge, the deductions became vague symbols of disobedience. They were never tied to real endangerment of the school. In fact, Harry's actions, if encouraged rather than punished, might have given the staff valuable insights into Voldemort's growing power. Yet Umbridge could not tolerate that. Her obsession with control outweighed any rational evaluation of the risks. This perverse misuse of the system showed how a mechanism meant to reward effort and discipline could be distorted into an instrument of tyranny. What makes this episode so striking is the way Rowling carefully juxtaposes Harry's internal state with the external humiliation. Inside, he was wrestling with visions of Arthur Weasley's attack, dreams that blurred the line between his own consciousness and Voldemort's. He could see it happening again, a long corridor and the terrible snake striking, the text tells us. He felt responsible, terrified that his mind itself had become a weapon in Voldemort's hands. His turn to Sirius was not a matter of childish rebellion, but an instinct to confide in the one adult he trusted most. Yet on the outside, Umbridge presented it as nothing more. The schoolboy misbehavior. The deduction of house points mocked the reality of his burden, reducing a battle for his very sanity into a petty classroom infraction. It is important to remember that this was not merely Harry's punishment, but also Sirius's silencing. Every time Harry was punished for contacting his godfather, it reinforced the Ministry's campaign to paint Sirius as a dangerous influence. In a twisted way, the point system became propaganda. Gryffindor was punished not because of Harry alone, but because of the stigma attached to Sirius. The godfather was cast as an outlaw, an unstable fugitive, and Umbridge wanted to sever any connection between the boy who lived and this symbol of defiance. The cost was measured in rubies drained from Gryffindor's hourglass, but the true target was trust itself. Each lost point was a reminder that even the act of seeking advice could be branded as treachery. Number 15, Lavender and the Predictions. Of all the strange punishments ever handed out in the halls of Hogwarts, one of the most puzzling remains the docking of points during a divination lesson when Lavender Brown dared to voice what half the class was already thinking. It was in Professor Sybil Trelawney's tower classroom, filled with the scent of burning incense and the dim glow of lanterns, that Lavender let slip her frustration. The incident appears trivial on the surface, just 5 points from Gryffindor. but it reveals the odd imbalance of justice at Hogwarts and the uncomfortable place divination held in the curriculum. Lavender, usually one of Trelawney's most devoted admirers, had spent weeks listening with wide eyes to prophecies about grim fates, failing romances, and early deaths. Yet one day, when the predictions stretched too far, she muttered that it was all rubbish. That single word cost her house valuable points, while the whispers and stifled laughter of her classmates went unnoticed. The selectivity of the punishment stands out, showing how arbitrary discipline could sometimes be at Hogwarts. What makes this punishment remarkable is the irony of Lavender being the one punished. Lavender Brown was not, like Hermione Granger, openly skeptical of divination from the start. She had, in fact, clung to Trelawney's predictions in ways that influenced her emotions and decisions. Readers remember her tears when Trelawney's prediction about a student's death appeared to come true after her rabbit died. She wanted to believe, desperately, in the mystique of the subject. For someone like Lavender to snap and call it nonsense reveals that the student's patience had reached a breaking point. If even the most willing believer dared to rebel, it was not an isolated act of rudeness but a symptom of the general mood in the room. Still, Trelawney chose Lavender, perhaps because her betrayal stung more than another round of Hermione's exasperated eye rolls. Trelawney's classroom was always a theatre of atmosphere, filled with draped curtains, crystal balls, and the scent of perfume that could make Harry feel half-dazed. The environment was designed to cultivate mystery and awe, but it also invited skepticism. Students like Dean Thomas and Seamus Finnegan found the sessions amusing, whispering jokes and snickering behind their hands. When Trelawney spoke of dark omens, the famous Grim appearing in tea leaves, or a doomed future for Harry, the reactions ranged from suppressed laughter to outright disbelief. Yet none of them were punished in the way Lavender was. The hypocrisy lies in the fact that Lavender merely said aloud what others had been thinking all along. Trelawney's response showed more about her own fragility than about maintaining discipline. The moment is made sharper when contrasted with how Hermione's skepticism was handled. Hermione, with her clear disdain, famously called divination woolly and later dropped the subject entirely, walking out in frustration after clashing with Trelawney. Her attitude was far more confrontational than Lavender's passing outburst, but it did not result in an immediate deduction of house points. It raises the question, why was Lavender singled out? Perhaps it was because Hermione's defiance fit her personality, and Trelawney had already written her off as a non-believer. Lavender, on the other hand, was supposed to be loyal. When loyalty cracked, Trelawney punished it harshly, as though to make an example. In this way, the 5 points symbolize betrayal more than disrespect. The books themselves underscore this inconsistency through Trelawney's erratic teaching style. Rowling describes her as a thin woman with enormous glasses that magnified her eyes to the size of saucers. Her pronouncements were delivered in a breathy, mystical voice that many students found comical. Harry once noted that she seemed to predict a death or disaster for nearly every occasion. The cumulative effect was that her predictions lost credibility. It is no wonder that students like Ron Weasley often stifled laughter. Yet there is no mention of Ron losing points for mockery. The selective enforcement turns Lavender's case into an anomaly, and one that reveals how subjective justice could be when filtered through a teacher's pride. The unfairness becomes even more obvious when measured against other subjects. Professor Snape, though harsh and intimidating, was at least consistent in docking points for cheek or mistakes. When Neville melted cauldrons, points were lost. When Harry spoke out of turn, points were deducted. There was a twisted sense of order to his punishments. With Trelawney, however, the rules seemed arbitrary. A whispered giggle could pass unnoticed, while a single word of dissent could spark her wrath. Lavender's "this is rubbish" was no more disruptive than Dean's muffled laughter, yet only one carried the penalty. It highlights the fragility of Trelawney's authority. Unlike Snape, who thrived on fear, she clung to the thin thread of belief. from students like Lavender to sustain her role. Lavender's punishment also illuminates the complicated relationship between teacher and student faith. Divination, unlike transfiguration or potions, relied on belief in the unseen. Trelawney herself admitted that the inner eye does not see upon command. Her authority rested not on demonstrable facts, but on the willingness of students to accept the aura of mystery. When Lavender declared disbelief, she punctured the illusion in front of everyone. For Trelawney, it was not just rudeness, but an existential threat. That explains why she reacted so severely, ignoring the laughter that could be dismissed as immaturity and punishing the words that directly attacked the fragile legitimacy of her subject. Lavender was not punished as a disruptive student, but as a heretic. Number 16, Harry and Dumbledore's password. When Harry Potter first approached the stone gargoyle that guarded Albus Dumbledore's office, he did not expect the entrance to one of the most powerful wizards in the world to depend on something as whimsical as a sweet. In Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, when Professor McGonagall led him to Dumbledore's office, she muttered the password, "Lemon drop," and the statue sprang to life, revealing the spiraling staircase. It was a moment of wonder for Harry, but also of quiet absurdity. The grand authority of the headmaster's office was accessible not through enchanted runes, not through ancient magic, but through the name of a Muggle candy. It felt both intimate and careless. A detail that made Dumbledore seem approachable, yet strangely impractical for the safety of the castle. Harry's curiosity about this system later created one of those almost comic but strangely unjust moments in Hogwarts life, when he was penalized for something the headmaster himself never took seriously. As the days passed, Harry began to understand that Dumbledore changed his passwords frequently, always selecting them from his endless supply of sweets. Sherbet lemon, fizzing Whizbee, cockroach cluster. The list went on, and each word seemed to echo Dumbledore's eccentric personality. For Harry, who was still adjusting to the unpredictable rhythm of life at Hogwarts, these passwords became an amusing secret that revealed the playful side of the headmaster. Yet secrets at Hogwarts rarely remained safe. Harry, in a moment of thoughtless honesty, mentioned to Ron and Hermione how unusual the password system was, and even joked about the possibility of breaking into Dumbledore's office by knowing his candy preferences. He did not intend any harm. The headmaster himself often made the words known in front of students, sometimes even saying them aloud when leaving the office accompanied by others. But in a place where rivalries between houses thrived, even the smallest slip could become ammunition for a teacher like Severus Snape. When word of Harry's careless revelation reached Snape, the reaction was as cold and sharp as one might expect. Snape wasted no time in using this against Harry, and his punishment came swiftly. Without hesitation, Snape deducted points from Gryffindor for what he termed a security violation. It was a strange accusation, one that seemed almost disproportionate given the headmaster's own light-hearted approach to the passwords. To Snape, however, the chance to remind Harry of his vulnerability and undermine Gryffindor's lead in the House Cup was too perfect to ignore. In the potions master's eyes, any breach of decorum, no matter how trivial, was grounds for punishment. Yet the irony was unmistakable. Dumbledore himself had never shown the slightest concern for how openly he used his candy-inspired codes. The injustice of this penalty lay in the contrast between Harry's small mistake and Dumbledore's own behavior. On more than one occasion, Dumbledore announced his passwords within earshot of entire groups of students. In Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, for instance, he said "cockroach cluster," as Harry and others stood near him. There was no attempt at secrecy, no caution, only the assumption that the trust he inspired would be enough to protect him. Dumbledore seemed to rely less on codes and more on his reputation and authority. His office was guarded by loyalty and respect, not by a word. Harry, by repeating this quirk to his friends, was only stating what had already been obvious to anyone who paid attention. Yet when Snape caught wind of it, it became another example of the double standard that haunted Harry's years at Hogwarts. It was not the first time that Snape had singled Harry out for something petty, nor would it be the last. Throughout the series, Snape consistently wielded his power to take points from Gryffindor with a sense of relish. In Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, he penalized Harry and Hermione for being out of bed at night, even though they were trying to prevent disaster. In Prisoner of Azkaban, he scolded Harry for talking back and subtracted points in the middle of class. This recurring theme created a climate in which Harry's smallest actions were magnified into supposed offences. The password slip was simply one more convenient excuse. The irony is that the punishment never truly improved security, nor did it stop the spread of knowledge about Dumbledore's eccentric codes. It only deepened the feeling of unfairness that permeated the student body whenever Snape was involved. The balance of justice at Hogwarts was often skewed, and nowhere was this more evident than in the handling of house points. Dumbledore's arbitrary generosity at the end of Harry's first year, when he awarded last-minute points to Gryffindor for bravery, proved how subjective the system could be. Snape's harsh penalties balanced against Dumbledore's benevolence created a strange tug-of-war, one that reflected their rivalry more than the actual behavior of students. Harry's experience with the password incident highlighted this absurdity. Snape could remove points under the guise of security concerns, while Dumbledore's own habits of blurting passwords out in the open never drew scrutiny. The scales were never even. The lesson Harry learned was not about protecting secrets, but about the uneven rules of authority. The absurdity becomes even clearer when considering the supposed role of the passwords. They existed to keep intruders out of the headmaster's office, yet the only intruders who might have posed a threat, dark wizards or Death Eaters, were hardly going to be thwarted by a suite. Voldemort himself, with his mastery of magic, would never be stopped by the word sherbet lemon. It was a thin veil of protection, a tradition more than a safeguard. Dumbledore likely understood this and did not truly expect his system to keep enemies away, but Snape's reaction framed Harry's careless comment as a genuine danger, as if Ron or Hermione might suddenly stage a raid on Dumbledore's private quarters. The punishment, then, was rooted less in logic and more in Snape's ongoing effort to belittle Harry and diminish his house's chances in the cup. Number 17, Neville and the Lost Memory. When Neville Longbottom misplaced the small notebook filled with Gryffindor Tower's passwords in Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, the consequences rippled far beyond his personal mistake. The boy, already known for his clumsiness and forgetfulness, carried with him the burden of being seen as the weak link in his house. His innocent yet reckless act allowed Sirius Black, who at that moment was still believed to be a dangerous murderer, to slip past the fat lady's portrait and enter the sanctuary of Gryffindor's common room. For Neville, it was another reminder that he could never seem to get things right, but for the house as a whole, it was a moment of collective punishment that raised questions about the fairness of the Hogwarts point system. The rules of Hogwarts had always been presented as absolute. House points would be awarded for good deeds, cleverness in class, or bravery in crisis, and they would be deducted for rule-breaking, recklessness, or incompetence. But the situation with Neville struck many readers as unusually harsh. The text itself emphasizes this imbalance. Rowling describes the discovery of the password list and the resulting reprimand with clarity. Professor McGonagall was livid. She gave Neville detention and forbade anyone to give him the passwords again. To make matters worse, Professor Snape docked 50 points from Gryffindor. The punishment was swift, humiliating, and more importantly, collective, since the 50 points did not come solely from Neville, but from the entire house's standing. Neville had already suffered earlier in the book when his classmates teased him for constantly forgetting the changing passwords. Hermione had been the one who usually helped him remember, but her patience was stretched thin as exams and danger piled up. The fact that Neville thought of writing the passwords down in order to help himself was not a sign of laziness or betrayal. It was the desperate act of a boy trying to cope in an environment that constantly highlighted his inadequacies. And yet, instead of seeing his effort to manage his own memory problems as something human and forgivable, the staff interpreted it as incompetence deserving of harsh reprisal. Snape, in particular, took the opportunity not only to discipline Neville, but to score a political point against Gryffindor. The loss of 50 house points was no small matter. In a system where 10 or 20 points could swing the race for the House Cup, such a penalty was devastating. For the other Gryffindors who had worked hard to accumulate points through classwork, Quidditch victories, and acts of bravery, the deduction must have felt like betrayal. But here lies the crux of the issue. Was it really Neville who betrayed them, or was it Snape who exploited an unfortunate situation to punish the innocent along with the guilty? The collective nature of the punishment turned the rest of Gryffindor against Neville, isolating him further and reinforcing his role as the house's scapegoat. This was not the first time the Hogwarts point system had been used in such a controversial way. Readers remember well in Philosopher's Stone when Harry, Hermione, and Neville himself lost points for sneaking out of bed at night, a decision that plummeted Gryffindor to last place in the standings. At that time, Neville had tried to stop the others, pleading that they would be caught, but his attempts were ignored. When he reluctantly followed, he was punished all the same. That early episode set the tone. Gryffindor's collective honor could be damaged by the mistakes of a few, and the innocent would pay along with the guilty. The later episode with the lost password notebook simply amplified the injustice. It is important to consider the perspective of the professors as well. From McGonagall's point of view, Sirius Black's infiltration into Gryffindor Tower represented a catastrophic security breach. She believed that Black was intent on murdering Harry Potter, and Neville's carelessness had placed Harry, as well as dozens of other students, at risk. In that sense, McGonagall's fury is understandable. Yet her chosen response to ban Neville from ever having the passwords again effectively excluded him from his own house's sanctuary. She did not merely discipline him, she branded him as a liability. The punishment carried a psychological weight heavier than the loss of house points. Snape's role in this drama was more vindictive. By docking 50 points, he transformed an individual's lapse into a collective humiliation. The Gryffindors, already wary of Neville's constant blunders, now had a tangible reason to resent him. Snape knew precisely what he was doing, driving a wedge between Neville and his peers, intensifying Gryffindor's disunity and asserting Slytherin dominance in the points tally. The punishment was not about justice, it was about power. It was about making sure that Gryffindor, and particularly Harry Potter, felt weakened. What makes the situation especially poignant is Neville's character arc across the series. In Prisoner of Azkaban, he is still the insecure boy who cannot remember spells, passwords, or even his toad. He embodies vulnerability in a world where survival often demands sharpness and courage. Yet by the final book, Neville stands in open defiance against Voldemort, drawing the sword of Gryffindor and destroying Nagini. The boy who once lost points for his house in humiliating ways becomes the hero who saves everyone. This transformation casts the earlier punishment in a new light. What seemed like incompetence was simply the growing pains of someone destined for greatness. Readers often ask whether Neville deserved the punishment at all. Yes, he erred in writing down the passwords, but the scale of the reprisal seems disproportionate. Was a detention not enough? Was exclusion from receiving future passwords not sufficient? Why was there a need to strip 50 points from the entire house? These questions highlight a recurring theme in the series. Authority figures often act arbitrarily, and their decisions are coloured by biases, grudges, and political agendas. Snape's treatment of Neville in this instance is just one example of the professor's long-standing hostility towards students who remind him of his own humiliations. It is also worth noting the psychological effect on Harry. In Prisoner of Azkaban, Harry is under immense pressure. Sirius Black is hunting him, dementors haunt the grounds, and the mystery of his parents' death weighs on him heavily. When the security breach occurs, Harry is once again confronted with the reality that others suffer because of him. Even though Neville's mistake had nothing to do with Harry's actions, the entire crisis reinforces Harry's sense of guilt. He knows that if he were not the target, Gryffindor Tower would not be under siege, and Neville's blunder would not carry such consequences. The docking of points thus deepens the novel's atmosphere of fear and blame. House points, in theory, are meant to inspire teamwork and encourage students to support one another. But in practice, moments like Neville's punishment reveal how fragile the system is. Instead of creating unity, collective penalties breed resentment. The students of Gryffindor could hardly feel proud of Neville when his mistake cost them so dearly. Instead of drawing together to protect one another, they were pushed apart, turning their frustration inward. The system that was supposed to reward solidarity instead promoted scapegoating. Rowling captures the cruelty of this dynamic with painful precision. Neville is not portrayed as malicious. He is portrayed as unlucky. His very nature, forgetful, anxious, perpetually out of place, sets him up to fail in a school that rewards precision and punishes mistakes. By docking 50 points, Snape institutionalized that failure, making Neville the symbol of Gryffindor's vulnerability. The incident lingers in readers' memories because it feels not only unjust, but cruelly unnecessary. Punishing the many for the mistakes of the one is not discipline, it is humiliation disguised as justice. Some readers interpret this episode as a deliberate narrative device. By placing Neville in the position of scapegoat, Rowling foreshadows his later redemption. The boy, mocked and punished for his incompetence, becomes the warrior who delivers the final blow against Voldemort. In this sense, the injustice of the point system is part of Neville's path toward resilience. Without the sting of such humiliation, he might not have found the strength to rise later. Yet as compelling as that literary explanation may be, it does not erase the sting of seeing a child punished in ways that erode his sense of belonging. The memory of this incident lingers not because it determined the outcome of the House Cup, but because it revealed the darker side of Hogwarts traditions. The school, often celebrated as a place of wonder and learning, could also be a place of unfairness and cruelty. Neville's lost notebook was not just a blunder, it was a mirror held up to the flawed system that treated children not as individuals with strengths and weaknesses, but as pawns in an ongoing contest of house pride. The punishment laid bare the pettiness of adults who used house points to settle their own grievances, leaving the students to carry the shame. In the end, the image of Neville standing small before McGonagall's wrath and Snape's sneer is unforgettable. The boy who only wanted to remember his passwords became the reason Gryffindor suffered a massive loss in points. The collective groans of his housemates must have echoed in his ears long after the incident. And yet, what this episode shows most clearly is not Neville's weakness, but the weakness of a system that confuses justice with collective humiliation. It is a reminder that behind the grandeur of Hogwarts lay moments of human unfairness, moments when authority failed its students. Number 18, Harry and talking in class. Harry Potter's 5th year at Hogwarts was the darkest of his school years, marked by mistrust, isolation, and the looming shadow of Lord Voldemort's return. The Ministry of Magic had decided to silence any voices that dared to spread the truth about the Dark Lord, and Dolores Umbridge was sent to Hogwarts as the High Inquisitor to enforce that silence. It was under her rule that the school saw one of the most ironic and frustrating examples of how the house point system could punish truth and courage rather than reward them. In her classroom, Harry lost points not for mischief, not for laziness, but for speaking the simple truth that Voldemort had come back. The absurdity of the punishment lies in the fact that history would prove him right, yet in that moment he was treated like a liar who deserved censure. The classroom where this moment unfolded was unlike any Harry had experienced before. Gone were the days of Lupin's hands-on lessons with Grindylows or Moody's thrilling demonstrations of curses. Instead, Umbridge's classes consisted of silent reading from defensive magical theory and strict prohibitions against any practical work. Harry and his classmates were instructed to sit quietly, to memorize pages, and to keep their opinions to themselves. For a boy who had faced basilisks, dementors, and Death Eaters, this hollow form of education was unbearable. It was in such an atmosphere of suffocating control that Harry's breaking point arrived. When Umbridge confidently declared that Voldemort had not returned, Harry felt something snap inside him. He could not accept such a blatant lie being presented as truth, not after watching Cedric Diggory fall lifeless to the ground in the graveyard. He had seen Voldemort rise again, felt his hand close around his arm, and watched the Death Eaters rally to him. To hear Umbridge dismiss all of this as fantasy was more than he could bear. In that instant he raised his voice in protest, refusing to let the false narrative stand unchallenged. His words carried not only anger, but also desperation, a plea for others to recognize the truth he was forced to carry alone. Umbridge's reaction was instantaneous and vicious. She accused Harry of spreading dangerous lies, of undermining the authority of the ministry, and of poisoning the minds of his fellow students. The classroom turned into a spectacle, with students watching in silence as the pink-clad professor delivered her judgment. And then, with the cold authority granted to her by the ministry, she docked points from Gryffindor. "You are lying, Mr. Potter," she snapped before announcing the deduction. For Harry, the punishment was not just a mark against his house, but a symbol of how the truth itself was being treated as a crime. The irony of the situation is sharp. The house point system was supposed to reward bravery, intelligence, loyalty, and honesty, the very qualities the founders valued. Yet here was Harry, demonstrating all of those things and being penalized for it. He had the courage to stand up against authority, the honesty to declare what he knew, and the loyalty to Cedric's memory to refuse silence. In any fair world, Gryffindor would have earned points that day, not lost them. But Hogwarts under Umbridge was no fair world. It had become a reflection of the ministry's corruption, where truth was inconvenient and punished. The absurdity becomes even clearer when compared with other moments in the series where students lost points for trivial infractions. Hermione once lost points for being an insufferable know-it-all. Neville lost them for forgetting passwords or dropping things. Ron lost them for being caught out of bed after curfew. These moments, while sometimes harsh, were grounded in school rules. But Harry's punishment was of a different kind altogether. It was political, ideological, and intended not to maintain order but to silence dissent. The system of points, meant to be a friendly competition, was turned into a tool of propaganda. The emotional weight of this moment is heightened by Harry's own frustration. He had spent the summer feeling isolated, doubted even by his friends at times, tormented by nightmares, and ignored by the wizarding community. When he spoke in Umbridge's class, it was not just an act of rebellion but also a cry for acknowledgement. He wanted someone, anyone, to recognize that he was not insane, not delusional, but a witness to the most dangerous truth of their time. Instead of recognition, he was met with derision and punishment, and the chasm between him and the rest of the wizarding world widened further. A key detail comes directly from Rowling's text. When Harry shouted, "He is back! Voldemort's back!" the classroom froze. The taboo around even speaking Voldemort's name made the outburst all the more shocking. But the most shocking part was how quickly it was dismissed. Umbridge treated the truth like insolence, and her punishment was meant to teach the rest of the class to stay quiet. This was not about discipline. It was about control. The house points Harry lost were a warning to every Gryffindor that honesty had no place in the new Hogwarts. Looking at this through the lens of Hogwarts history, the moment is particularly strange. Throughout the series, the school often rewarded Harry for bravery that bent or even broke rules. He earned massive amounts of points in his first year for preventing Voldemort from stealing the stone. He received admiration for surviving the Triwizard Tournament. Yet in his 5th year, bravery of a different kind, bravery in words rather than deeds, was condemned. The lesson here seems to be that under corrupt authority, even the values of the school itself could be twisted to serve an agenda. The broader irony becomes unbearable when one remembers how the wizarding world eventually reacted. Within a year, the ministry itself acknowledged Voldemort's return, the Daily Prophet printed the truth, and the wizarding population prepared for war. Everything Harry said in that classroom was proven right, and yet in the records of Gryffindor's hourglass, the rubies taken that day never returned. The punishment remained, as if to mock the idea that truth had any measurable value in the house point system. This raises an uncomfortable question about Hogwarts itself. If points can be so easily manipulated to punish students for honesty, does the system have any integrity at all? The supposed impartiality of the hourglasses was meaningless when professors could dock points for personal reasons. Snape did it constantly out of spite. But Umbridge elevated the practice to a new level. She docked points not because she disliked Harry's tone or behavior, but because she wanted to erase the truth. In that light, the punishment was not just unjust, but a symbol of how fragile the idea of fairness at Hogwarts really was. It also highlights Harry's role as the unwanted prophet. He carried knowledge no one else wished to acknowledge, and when he voiced it, he was punished. This mirrors many historical and literary figures whose warnings were ignored until it was too late. In Umbridge's classroom, Harry became a Cassandra figure, cursed to speak the truth, yet treated as a liar. The loss of points to Gryffindor was the school's way of branding him troublesome rather than heroic, even though history would vindicate him. Students like Hermione, Ron, and Neville watched this scene unfold with horror. They knew Harry spoke the truth, but their silence reflects the fear that Umbridge's regime created. To speak out was to risk detention, humiliation, or worse. In that environment, losing points for Gryffindor was the least of Harry's worries, but it carried symbolic weight nonetheless. It meant that even the school itself, which had once seemed to stand behind him, had been bent against him. The Gryffindor hourglass was bleeding rubies, a visual reminder that truth was now a liability. Years later, when readers look back at this scene, it stands out because it captures the injustice of Harry's 5th year in a single moment. The unfairness of the points deduction symbolizes the broader silencing of Harry's voice and the denial of Voldemort's return. It reminds us that bravery is not always celebrated and truth is not always rewarded. Sometimes, as in Harry's case, they come at a cost. That cost might be rubies slipping away in the Gryffindor hourglass, or it might be the loneliness of standing alone against the tide. But in the end, it is precisely that willingness to pay the cost that makes Harry the hero of the story. The incident in Umbridge's class will always be remembered as one of the most absurd uses of the house point system. It revealed the system's vulnerability to corruption, the cruelty of an authority determined to rewrite reality, and the courage of a boy who refused to stay silent. Harry's punishment was unjust, but it became a defining moment in his journey, showing that sometimes telling the truth means losing more than you gain in the short term. And yet, in the long sweep of history, those lost points mean nothing compared to the vindication that came when Voldemort finally stepped out of the shadows and the world admitted that Harry had been right all along. Number 19, Ron and his homework. In the long list of incidents where points were deducted from Gryffindor House, some were grave, some were petty, and others were simply absurd. Among the most comical, yet strangely unfair, was the case involving Ron Weasley and his potions homework, an episode that exposed not only his own struggles, but also the merciless teaching style of Professor Severus Snape. It was not an incident tied to danger in the Forbidden Forest, nor the breaking of curfew, nor even a duel gone wrong. Instead, it was about something far more mundane, homework. The triviality of it, coupled with the punishment meted out, became a striking reminder that in Snape's dungeon classroom, justice was always slanted, and students were often punished not for lack of effort, but for simply being Gryffindors. Ron's trouble began with his chronic problem in potions, a subject that required precision, patience, and an almost obsessive attention to detail. Unlike Hermione Granger, who could copy instructions flawlessly, or even Harry, who managed to stumble through with average competence, Ron consistently found himself frustrated with the subject. His cauldron often produced the wrong color or texture, and his essays on potion theory were filled with vague explanations. It was during one of these assignments that his difficulties reached a point of comedy. He turned in a sheet so badly blotched with ink that parts were unreadable, a desperate effort to complete the homework at all costs. In a fit of poor judgment, he borrowed from Harry's work to fill in the blanks, hoping Snape would not notice. The classroom atmosphere during that day was heavy with the usual gloom. The stone walls, damp with condensation, carried the faint smell of ingredients simmering in cauldrons. Snape moved like a shadow between the desks, robes billowing as he collected parchments. Ron's page looked pathetic beside Hermione's immaculate script. When Snape's eyes fell upon it, the outcome was inevitable. "I suppose you think this is acceptable," he sneered in a tone recorded in Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. His dark eyes flicked between Ron and Harry, for it was obvious that parts of the assignment had been copied. The ink stains, the poorly constructed sentences, and the half-hearted attempt at theory gave him the perfect excuse. The punishment was swift. Ron was not only berated in front of the class, but Gryffindor lost several points. It was the sort of collective consequence Snape relished, penalized the house so that resentment would build among classmates. The absurdity of the situation lay in the fact that Ron's lack of clarity in potion theory was not the result of laziness alone. Snape had never been an effective teacher for Gryffindors. He thrived on humiliation rather than guidance, making learning in his lessons nearly impossible for those he disliked. By taking points from Gryffindor for Ron's fumbling homework, Snape turned academic difficulty into a disciplinary offense, a practice that blurred the lines between teaching and punishment. What made the scene so darkly comic was how disproportionate the reaction was. Students regularly struggled in various subjects. Neville Longbottom often melted cauldrons or made disastrous errors, yet his mistakes, though mocked, did not always result in lost points. In Ron's case, the deduction was tied not to disrupting class or breaking rules, but to the quality of his written work. To make matters worse, Ron was already embarrassed by his academic shortcomings. Having them broadcasted and punished only deepened his frustration. In Philosopher's Stone, Harry himself noted how Snape seemed to single out Gryffindors for humiliation, and this episode was yet another demonstration. From the perspective of fairness, this punishment was nonsensical. The responsibility of a teacher is to guide students toward mastery, not to penalize them for failing to understand without help. If Ron misunderstood potion theory, the appropriate response should have been explanation or encouragement. Instead, Snape seized upon the moment to reduce Gryffindor's tally, as though a poorly written parchment somehow damaged school discipline. The irony was painful. A teacher unwilling to teach well could then claim moral authority by docking points from those who suffered because of his methods. One cannot ignore the broader symbolism of this moment. Gryffindor, a house celebrated for courage and loyalty, often bore the brunt of Snape's bias. Ron's homework fiasco was less about education and more about house rivalry. Each lost point stoked the ongoing competition with Slytherin. The deduction made it clear that Snape's allegiance was not only to his own house, but against Gryffindor. A student's clumsy essay became ammunition in a larger war of pride and power. The comedy, therefore, was not in Ron's blotched parchment, but in the sheer absurdity that such a trivial matter could be weaponized. Ron himself, though humiliated, did not let the matter crush him entirely. His friendship with Harry and Hermione kept him afloat. But the humiliation lingered. Later incidents in potions would continue to show his inadequacy, culminating in Hermione stepping in to correct or assist him more than once. Yet the memory of having lost points for something as harmless as messy handwriting and half-understood theory became part of the lore of Snape's cruelty. It was whispered among Gryffindors as an example of how unfairly their house was treated. Students knew that their performance in potions was judged less by knowledge and more by their colours and loyalties. Snape's decision also raised a broader question. What is the purpose of point systems in schools of magic? Ostensibly, points were designed to reward collective discipline and excellence, but when they were deducted for reasons unrelated to behaviour, they ceased to function as motivation and became tools of oppression. Ron's homework episode demonstrated the fragility of the system. The balance of house points could be swayed not by bravery, cleverness, or even rule-breaking, but by a single teacher's disdain for a student's sloppy essay. This exposed the system as arbitrary and deeply flawed. For Harry, the event carried its own sting. Knowing Ron had borrowed from him, he shared in the embarrassment, though not the punishment. Harry had witnessed unfairness before, but this moment etched itself in his understanding of Snape's character. Later, when Snape's deeper loyalties were revealed in the final books, moments like this added complexity. He had always been cruel to Gryffindors, but the root of his cruelty came from personal bias, not principle. The Ron homework episode was a snapshot of this. Petty cruelty disguised as discipline. Hermione's reaction, though not explicitly recorded in the text, can be imagined with ease. She would have been horrified to see Ron punished for academic incompetence. To Hermione, who valued learning above all, such an approach from Snape was not just harsh, but counterproductive. She frequently tried to help Ron improve, but against Snape's hostility, her efforts seemed small. This dynamic illustrated how the trio balanced one another. Hermione's diligence clashed with Ron's carelessness, while Harry mediated between them, caught in the web of Snape's prejudice. Even outside Gryffindor, this incident would have been perceived as comical. Slytherins no doubt snickered at Ron's humiliation, seeing his punishment as a deserved joke. For them, it was further proof that Gryffindors were clumsy and undeserving of their reputation. What they missed, however, was that the incident said more about Snape than about Ron. The laughter in the dungeon masked the failure of a teacher who could not find a way to inspire rather than degrade. The narrative value of this episode lies in its triviality. Great sagas are built not only on epic battles and life-or-death struggles, but on small, absurd injustices. Ron's homework debacle was a microcosm of the broader theme of unfairness at Hogwarts. The school was not a perfect institution of magical learning, but a place where biases, rivalries, and flawed authority figures shaped student lives. The fact that Gryffindor's fortunes could be damaged by something as laughable as a messy parchment emphasized how fragile and arbitrary their victories and defeats could be. When reflecting on the history of Hogwarts, this small incident stands as a reminder that not all battles are fought with wands. Sometimes they are fought with ink and parchment, and the casualties are not bodies, but dignity. Ron Weasley, forever caught between his ambition to prove himself and his tendency toward clumsiness, became the victim of a system that punished weakness rather than nurtured strength. The comedy lay in the ridiculousness of the situation. The tragedy lay in the fact that such comedy came at the expense of a boy's pride and a house's honor. And so the story of Ron's potions homework lives on as one of the most nonsensical examples of house point deductions. It illustrates how a flawed educational system, dominated by personal bias, could turn learning into a spectacle of punishment. It shows that even in a world of magic, injustice thrives in the small moments. Above all, it demonstrates that for Gryffindors, and for Ron in particular, every day in Snape's dungeon was not only a test of knowledge, but of endurance. Number 20. Harry and visiting Hagrid. When Harry Potter, Ron Weasley, and Hermione Granger slipped down the castle corridors late at night after visiting Rubeus Hagrid, they were not prepared for the humiliation that awaited them. They had gone to Hagrid's hut, because he was more than a teacher's assistant or gamekeeper in their eyes. He was their friend, someone who represented warmth in a school that often felt cold and alienating. The visit was not born of mischief, but of loyalty. Hagrid had been raising a Norwegian ridgeback dragon, a creature highly illegal to keep, and his fondness for dangerous animals had put him in trouble before. The 3 first years wanted to support him and to witness the hatching of Norbert, a moment that Hagrid treated almost like the arrival of his own child. In the narrative of Hogwarts punishments, however, intent never seemed to matter. That night, their compassion turned into one of the most baffling deductions of house points Gryffindor ever experienced. The system of rewarding or penalizing houses was designed to encourage discipline and loyalty, yet it often functioned as a blunt instrument, stripping away dignity in moments where justice demanded nuance. When Professor McGonagall caught Harry, Hermione and Neville wandering the halls, Neville being the innocent one who only followed because he feared losing Gryffindor more points, the result was devastating. 50 points were deducted from Harry, another 50 from Hermione, and points from Neville as well, a punishment so severe that it plunged Gryffindor from the top of the house. Standings to the very bottom overnight. What is strange here is that the students had not been sneaking into a forbidden corridor for fun or to flout authority. They had been dealing with the fallout of Hagrid's dragon obsession, and their nighttime wandering was an extension of their friendship. Yet the house point system treated the act as if it were pure disobedience, devoid of loyalty, courage, or good intentions. The moment was especially harsh because Harry was still adjusting to life as a student who carried expectations larger than himself. Until then, Gryffindor had been celebrated for its victories on the Quidditch pitch and its reputation for bravery. But as the points drained from the hourglasses in the Great Hall, the entire house turned against him. Rowling writes that Gryffindor House was in disgrace. From being the most popular and admired house, it was now the least. The visual of emeralds or rubies falling from the enchanted hourglasses symbolized not just lost points, but lost respect, and Harry felt every pair of eyes judging him. In that moment, the punishment overshadowed any good intention behind the midnight errand. The house system demanded conformity, not compassion, and the price of stepping outside the rules was collective shame. The irony lay in the fact that Harry and Hermione had acted with honesty earlier in the situation. They had not hidden Hagrid's dragon entirely. They sought to solve the problem by arranging Norbert's transfer to Charlie Weasley, who worked with dragons in Romania. Their decision was not reckless but calculated, and it sought to protect both Hagrid and the school from an illegal creature. Yet the small misstep of being caught outside the dormitory at night carried greater weight in the school's disciplinary structure than the nobility of their motives. In storytelling terms, this highlighted the absurd rigidity of Hogwarts authority. The very qualities the Sorting Hat praised in Gryffindor, courage, loyalty, friendship, became the reason Gryffindor suffered its most humiliating public loss of points. The punishment was also unevenly distributed. Hagrid himself, the adult responsible for endangering the students by involving them in his secret, was not penalized in the same visible way. He was given a scolding, but no points could be taken from him, and so the burden fell squarely on the shoulders of 11-year-olds. This imbalance underscored a flaw in the Hogwarts system. Adults could make errors and receive warnings, but children bore punishments that affected not only themselves but dozens of their peers. To Harry, who had grown up in the oppressive household of the Dursleys, the echo of unfair treatment was impossible to ignore. He was being punished not for selfishness or cruelty, but for being loyal to a friend. When the narrative describes Harry's humiliation after the punishment, the emotional weight is immense. He was ostracized by his peers. Whispers followed him through the corridors, and he felt as though he had let everyone down. The book notes that Harry had never felt so miserable. He was even beginning to wish he'd never come to Hogwarts. Such a line strikes the reader with its raw despair because Hogwarts was supposed to be his refuge from neglect and abuse, the magical world where he truly belonged. To have that refuge turned into a place of shame because of a rigid system of point deduction seemed not just cruel but nonsensical. The heart of the story is that a system designed to encourage loyalty actually punished it. The collective nature of house punishment added an element of peer pressure that warped friendships. Ron, though not directly punished with point deductions that night, also suffered from the backlash Gryffindor received. Students who had once cheered Harry on as Seeker now muttered about how he had betrayed them all. The sense of solidarity within Gryffindor fractured, showing how fragile the bonds of house pride really were. Rowling cleverly used this episode to demonstrate that loyalty and courage can be invisible qualities, easily overshadowed by the blunt arithmetic of rubies lost and gained. In other words, a system that claimed to reward bravery instead punished it when it did not fit the narrow definitions set by authority. The specific quote from McGonagall in this episode still stings. Nothing gives you the right to wander the school at night, especially these days. It's very dangerous, and 50 points will be taken from Gryffindor. The language shows how rules were applied without context, as if the situation were identical to sneaking around for a midnight duel or raiding the kitchens. The professor's stern adherence to regulation erased the nuance of why the students were outside. That same night, Draco Malfoy, who had been prowling for his own reasons, also faced punishment, but his act was motivated by spite rather than friendship. Yet both infractions were leveled under the same system of point deduction, equating loyalty to cruelty in the eyes of the school. In a way, the episode reflects on the theme of institutional blindness that runs through the series. The Ministry of Magic, Hogwarts governors, and even the headmaster often failed to distinguish between intention and action. The system of points mirrored that blindness. It created a culture where appearances and conformity mattered more than substance, where a child's courage in helping a friend could be reinterpreted as arrogance or carelessness. The message that Harry absorbed was not be loyal, but stay hidden, a lesson that contradicted everything Gryffindor was supposed to stand for. Yet paradoxically, this punishment prepared Harry for future trials. Being shamed by his house forced him to internalize what it meant to stand alone, even when he was convinced of his own rightness. The experience of watching his peers turn their backs on him hardened him for moments later in the series when the wizarding world at large would refuse to believe his warnings about Voldemort. In that sense, the injustice of losing house points became a crucible for the kind of leader he would later become. It is ironic that the very system meant to control him ended up shaping his resilience. The night Harry, Hermione, and Neville were caught also served to illuminate Neville's arc. Neville had ventured out of the dormitory not for mischief, but because he feared losing more points due to Harry and Hermione's actions. His intention was to prevent disaster, and instead he shared in the punishment. This detail made the point system look even more absurd. An anxious boy already struggling with confidence was penalized for trying to protect his house's reputation. The punishment chipped away at his fragile self-esteem and underscored how easily good intentions could be trampled by rigid authority. Years later, when Neville would show his bravery against Voldemort, this early humiliation would stand in stark contrast to his growth. The strange handling of the Norbert incident also emphasized how the adults of Hogwarts underestimated the students' ability to handle responsibility. Harry, Ron, and Hermione successfully arranged Norbert's departure, an act that required planning, secrecy, and courage. Yet the school refused to acknowledge their resourcefulness, choosing instead to highlight their minor disobedience. The tragedy is that children were punished for doing the right thing in the wrong way. This paradox is a recurring motif in the Harry Potter series, where the young often demonstrate more moral clarity than the adults meant to guide them. The punishment also had narrative consequences that extended beyond shame. It directly led to the detention in the Forbidden Forest, where Harry encountered the cloaked figure drinking unicorn blood, later revealed to be Voldemort's parasitic form. This shows how an arbitrary penalty altered the course of the story. A single night's deduction of points propelled Harry toward one of his earliest confrontations with the darkness he was destined to fight. What seemed like a trivial injustice within the school's walls turned into a stepping stone in the grander struggle between good and evil. Perhaps the strangest element of the entire situation is how the house point system transformed human emotion into numbers. Friendship became 50, loyalty became 50, fear and honesty became 50. Rubies tumbling down the hourglass became a symbol of lost trust, not just in Harry but in the fairness of Hogwarts itself. The system, designed as a motivational tool, stripped away the complexity of human motives and replaced it with a cold calculation that valued obedience over courage. For Harry and his friends, this moment marked the realization that Hogwarts was not always the just, magical sanctuary it appeared to be. It could be as unfair as the Muggle world Harry thought he had left behind. Number 21. Ginny and her defenders. In the corridors of Hogwarts, few professors inspired such dread and silent rage as Severus Snape. His very presence could silence a room, and his sharp tongue was as much a weapon as his wand. Yet beneath his calculated cruelty, there were moments when his behavior revealed not only his bias, but also the fragility of the point system that governed student morale. One of the most glaring examples occurs in Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, during a moment that seems trivial at first but cuts deep into the question of fairness. When Ginny Weasley played as a chaser during a Quidditch match and Snape sneered at her performance, several Gryffindors, unable to hold their tongues, rose in her defense. The response was immediate and brutal, a deduction of 10 points from their house. The peculiar part was not the punishment itself, but the way it extended like a contagion. It was not a matter of who spoke the words, but the sheer audacity of anyone daring to stand against Snape. In his eyes, opposition was a collective crime, and the whole group became guilty. The situation stood as an open wound in the already fractured system of authority within the school. Students were conditioned to believe that the house points determined not only victory in the House Cup, but also their sense of belonging and pride. To lose points was not simply a reprimand, it was a scar upon one's loyalty to the house. Snape weaponized this fear. The quote from the book captures the moment with cold clarity. 10 points from Gryffindor. Don't bother telling me which of you it was. I have no doubt you all contributed. His words linger, not just as a punishment, but as a declaration of power. It didn't matter if one voice had risen or 5, the price would be shared. It was a system designed not for justice, but for silencing dissent, for punishing solidarity. Ginny herself was at the center of this storm, though she had said little more than what was expected of a Gryffindor with fire in her veins. Snape's comment about her skill was unnecessary, a jab designed to humiliate. Ginny's defenders, loyal friends like Demelza Robbins and even Harry himself, reacted in the way anyone might when a peer is unfairly ridiculed. Their instinct was to shield her from cruelty. Yet the punishment flipped the narrative. Suddenly, Ginny was no longer just a student being belittled. She became the cause of collective suffering. By defending her, her friends had made Gryffindor weaker, not stronger. Snape's cruelty had achieved its intended effect. Solidarity transformed into guilt. There is an unsettling irony here, for Gryffindor was the house that celebrated courage and loyalty. Its students were taught to prize bravery above all else, to stand firm even when silence might be easier. But in that moment, bravery was punished with mathematical precision. To speak out against injustice meant docking points that could one day cost the house the cup. The paradox grew clearer. Gryffindors could live up to their values, or they could protect their points, but rarely both. Snape exploited this tension masterfully. His punishment was not random, but calculated to erode the very identity of the house he despised. For Harry, this moment fit into a larger pattern of abuse. He had long understood that Snape's punishments often exceeded reason, yet the randomness of it never ceased to sting. The words from the book carried an almost mocking tone. "Anyone else want to try their luck?" Snape's challenge was not an invitation, but a warning. Harry, who had spent years bristling under Snape's gaze, knew the danger of further protest. Yet watching Ginny, cheeks flushed from embarrassment and anger, made the injustice feel unbearable. For once, Harry was not the only target. Snape had struck at the heart of Gryffindor itself, where unity became a weakness. Ginny's position is important to understand in this scene. By the 6th book, she had grown from a shy, timid girl into a confident, sharp-witted witch who could stand toe-to-toe with her brothers. Her Quidditch skills were more than competent, and her courage rivaled Harry's. To have her abilities dismissed by a professor in front of her peers was not just cruel but insulting to her growth. And yet Ginny did not crumble. She had allies who rushed to defend her, and this reaction showed how deeply respected she had become within Gryffindor. That Snape managed to twist that loyalty into a liability remains one of the most infuriating aspects of the scene. What makes this incident particularly striking is how it contrasts with other punishments in the series. When students in Slytherin behaved poorly, Snape often turned a blind eye. Even when Draco Malfoy insulted Gryffindors or broke rules, the professor's retribution was negligible, the imbalance was glaring, and the Gryffindors knew it. The weight of unfairness pressed down harder than the loss of points itself. They weren't just competing in Quidditch or the House Cup. They were locked in a battle against a professor who wielded authority like a blade. The lesson was bitterly clear. Loyalty to one another would not protect them from Snape's bias. It would only make them more vulnerable. This raises a deeper question about the fairness of Hogwarts as a whole. The house point system was designed to encourage discipline and teamwork, yet in Snape's hands it became a tool of intimidation. Students were meant to believe their voices mattered, but in reality, dissent could erase weeks of hard-earned points. What did that teach them? That silence was safer than courage, that individual defense of a friend could bring collective suffering. For Gryffindor, this was an attack on the very ideals that defined them. It was not just a punishment, it was a psychological strategy to weaken the spirit of a house he detested. The students themselves must have felt the sting more deeply than the book explicitly reveals. Imagine returning to the common room, where every eye looks at you as the reason the hourglass of rubies has sunk lower. Imagine the hushed whispers, not of support, but of frustration, knowing your attempt at loyalty has endangered the glory of the house. Snape knew this outcome. He thrived on it. By punishing collectively, he planted seeds of resentment within Gryffindor. Loyalty, once their greatest weapon, became a source of tension. For Ginny and her defenders, the cost of bravery was isolation. One must also note how this scene foreshadows larger themes in the story. The idea that authority can punish solidarity, that the powerful can bend systems to silence the brave, echoes the greater conflict with Voldemort. Hogwarts became a microcosm of the wider war. The students were forced to learn harsh lessons early. Speaking out against cruelty has consequences, and sometimes those consequences are shared by everyone around you. It is an initiation into the darker realities of resistance. For Harry, Ginny, and the others, this incident was a smaller version of the sacrifices they would later face on a far greater battlefield. Snape's behavior also calls into question the role of teachers in shaping courage. While McGonagall encouraged her students to take pride in their abilities and speak truth, Snape made truth itself a punishable act. This duality within Hogwarts created a confusing moral landscape for the students. Which was right? To be bold, as Gryffindor encouraged, or to be cautious, as Snape enforced. The contradiction was not merely academic, it was lived every day in the classroom and on the Quidditch pitch. Ginny's humiliation and her defender's punishment embodied that tension vividly. Even more telling is how this incident shaped Ginny's relationship with authority figures. She had already endured trauma in her first year with the Chamber of Secrets, and by the sixth, she had no patience for mockery. Defiance was part of her growth, and in some ways, Snape's cruelty only sharpened her resilience. But one cannot ignore the bitterness it must have left behind. To be punished not for wrongdoing, but for being defended instilled in her, and likely others, a deep mistrust of the fairness of the system. It revealed that rules were not impartial. They bent beneath the will of those who enforced them. The echoes of this event resound in the choices characters make later. Harry himself would frequently grapple with the idea of speaking up versus protecting others from suffering. He carried the weight of knowing his defiance often cost Gryffindor points. Ginny, however, rarely hesitated. She continued to speak her mind, continued to fight, and ultimately joined Dumbledore's army with unwavering resolve. Perhaps the injustice she experienced only strengthened her sense that real courage was not measured in rubies in an hourglass, but in loyalty that endures punishment. Ultimately, the moment when Ginny's defenders lost 10 points is not just a footnote of pettiness. It crystallizes Snape's role as an antagonist in the daily lives of the students. It shows how authority can twist systems into instruments of fear. It shows how solidarity can be punished to create division. And most importantly, it underscores the strength of those who, despite these costs, continued to defend each other. The rubies in Gryffindor's hourglass could be taken, but their loyalty, tested in the crucible of injustice, became the foundation of their eventual victory. Number 22, Harry and the Pensive. In the pensive chamber, Harry Potter leaned forward, unable to resist the silvery surface that swirled with Severus Snape's most guarded memories. The moment was charged with forbidden allure, the weight of a truth Harry had no right to touch. He fell through the surface, and the world bent around him into scenes he was never supposed to witness. James Potter, young and reckless, humiliating Snape near the lake, Sirius Black, watching with delight, Lily Evans, shouting in anger. Harry's pulse quickened, shame mixing with fascination. He saw his father not as a hero, but as a bully. The pain of this revelation was profound, but what followed, the punishment, was perhaps stranger than the memory itself. For when Snape dragged him back into the office, furious and humiliated, he did not simply scold Harry, he took points from Gryffindor. The line between private violation and collective consequence blurred, and the question lingered, why should a whole house bear the brunt of a single boy's transgression? Snape's anger was entirely understandable. Harry had invaded the professor's most personal territory, memories so raw that they were kept sealed inside a magical basin designed to guard thoughts from contamination. When Harry saw the words "turn out your pockets" written with venom in the text, one could almost hear the fury behind the act. Yet the curious thing is that the matter was, by its very nature, private. Harry had not disrupted a class, cheated in front of others, or caused disorder that reflected on his peers. He had trespassed on Snape's soul, and yet the retribution was framed in terms of Gryffindor house points. Take 50 points from Gryffindor. Snape's voice, cutting and cold, punished not just the boy, but every student tied to the lion crest. It was less about Harry's intrusion and more about public humiliation, a declaration that Gryffindor's pride must suffer for the sins of its favorite child. This is the paradox of Hogwarts' system of discipline. The house point structure was meant as a device to reward loyalty, bravery, scholarship, and discipline, binding students to a communal identity. Yet again and again, personal grudges warped the system into something punitive and arbitrary. In this particular case, Harry's behavior was reckless and deserving of some reprimand. He had, after all, ignored Snape's explicit warning not to touch the pensive. Still, what makes the situation unusual is how the professor translated this private violation into public shame. Gryffindor was reduced in the tallies not because of an infraction against Hogwarts rules, but because of a breach of Snape's personal dignity. The scales of justice tilted, and the whole house stumbled downward, though none of them had dipped a hand into the silver basin. One cannot ignore the peculiar irony here. Harry's curiosity in that moment was not driven by arrogance, but by the ache of questions unanswered. His parents' past hovered like a fog over his life, and the pensive offered him clarity he had long been denied. The text makes clear his inability to stop himself. Harry bent over the pensive, curiosity welling inside him. His decision was wrong, but it was also deeply human. What child would not wish to know more of a lost father and the tangled history with a teacher who hated him? Snape's reaction, however, came not only from fury, but from shame. For Snape's memories revealed his own humiliation, his vulnerabilities, his past defeat at the hands of James Potter. Harry's trespass did not merely break a boundary, it exposed Snape's most painful wound, and so the punishment was laced with vengeance, not justice. The communal punishment through house points amplified this vengeance. Gryffindor students had no knowledge of Harry's action, no complicity, and yet the banners in the Great Hall recorded their loss. Imagine the murmurings of Seamus Dean or even Hermione when the tally dropped. They would see the numbers sink and know once again that Harry had cost them dearly. Already infamous for detentions and penalties, Harry bore a reputation as both hero and liability. Each time Snape announced a deduction, the resentment in Gryffindor's common room deepened. What began as Harry's solitary mistake became a fracture within the house, breeding tension among friends. Snape understood this effect, perhaps even relished it, knowing that Gryffindor pride was fragile, and that dragging Harry down meant dragging all of them with him. This is why the punishment feels disproportionate and strange. In a world of wands and magic, personal violations of privacy could have been handled with direct consequences, detentions, further occlumency lessons, or even a private warning to Dumbledore. Instead, the communal punishment system was twisted into a weapon of embarrassment. It was not about reformation, nor about preventing future curiosity. It was about making Harry despised by his own peers. And herein lies the great flaw in Hogwarts' disciplinary structure. When the authority of a professor is mixed with the biases of personal history, the lines between fairness and cruelty vanish. Snape's grudge against James Potter spilled into his treatment of James's son, and the entire House of Gryffindor bore the weight of that bitterness. The narrative of Harry's school years is littered with similar examples. Earlier, when Harry lost 200 points, after being caught wandering at night in his first year, the collective outcry of Gryffindor House nearly broke him. Harry had never known such shame, the text describes, because every face in the common room turned against him. His punishment in that moment went far beyond the rule he broke. He was shunned, ridiculed, seen as the boy who cost them the chance at the House Cup. That memory should remind us of the pensive incident, for once again Harry became the lightning rod for anger, though the real weight of the sin belonged only to him. Snape weaponized this structure, repeating the humiliation Harry had once endured, ensuring the boy's peers shared in the consequences of his personal choices. It is worth considering how this system shaped Harry's growth. Every time points were taken, his sense of responsibility expanded beyond his own skin. He was punished not simply as an individual, but as a symbol. This paradox created both strength and isolation. Strength because Harry learned to carry the weight of others' expectations, to live as a figure larger than himself. Isolation because each mistake widened the gulf between him and those who did not share his burdens. The pensive moment crystallized this duality. He sought the truth about his parents, but in doing so, he endangered his bond with Gryffindor. It was not only Snape's wrath that scarred him, but the knowledge that his curiosity dragged his friends down too. Snape's decision also reveals something darker about Hogwarts culture. By reducing private violations to house points, the professors transformed the communal competition into an arena of power. Each subtraction was not just a penalty, but a weapon in the larger war between houses. For Snape, deducting from Gryffindor was both personal vengeance and strategic sabotage. He struck 2 blows at once, at Harry and at Gryffindor's standing in the cup. The pensive was a perfect opportunity, a sin invisible to all others, yet one he could publicly translate into a cut against his enemies. In that light, the punishment becomes less a response to Harry's mistake and more an act of inter-house rivalry disguised as discipline. The irony is that this distortion undermined the very values the house system was supposed to uphold. Courage, loyalty, and integrity were meant to be nurtured, but when punishment served private vendettas, they fostered resentment and division instead. Gryffindors learned not that Harry should respect privacy, but that Snape would always find a way to drag them down through him. Slytherins, meanwhile, saw in every point deduction a victory over their rivals, regardless of fairness. The pensive incident thus reveals how Hogwarts' mechanisms for discipline sometimes corroded its spirit of unity. What should have been a moment of private correction became fuel for the bitter war of banners. One cannot ignore the thematic significance either. Harry glimpsed his father's cruelty, saw Lily's disappointment, and felt the sting of inherited shame. The pensive stripped away illusions, teaching him that heroes were flawed and enemies human. Yet the aftermath, losing house points, shifted the meaning from personal growth to communal burden. Instead of reflecting quietly on his father's failings and Snape's suffering, Harry was forced to deal with the fallout among his friends. The lesson in empathy was drowned out by the noise of public consequence. It was as though Hogwarts itself conspired to keep him from personal reflection by chaining him to the scoreboard of house rivalries. Snape's fury in that moment cannot be separated from his lifelong torment. For years, James Potter's laughter and Sirius Black's cruelty had haunted him. To see Harry's eyes, so like Lily's, peering into those wounds was intolerable. His punishment was not about teaching Harry respect, but about reclaiming a shred of dignity. And yet that reclamation came at a cost. By dragging the Gryffindor total downward, he displayed his pain not as strength, but as bitterness. The House Cup became his battlefield, the points his weapons, and Harry his captive opponent. Thus, the pensive incident stands as one of the clearest windows into Snape's psyche, proud, wounded, and vengeful, wielding authority to mask vulnerability. For Harry, the injustice lingered. He could not undo what he saw, nor repair Snape's dignity. He could not explain to his friends why Gryffindor's points vanished again, nor ask them to share the burden of his guilt. He carried both shame and anger, trapped between sympathy for Snape's humiliation and resentment at being publicly penalized for private curiosity. This strange collision of personal and collective punishment carved itself into the rhythm of his Hogwarts years. The pensive was not only a basin of memory, but a mirror of how the school system transformed private trespasses into public trials, binding one boy's choices to the fate of an entire house. And so, in the shadow of the pensive, the question remains, was this justice, or was it simply vengeance disguised as discipline? Harry's invasion of Snape's memory was wrong, but the deduction of house points distorted the meaning of the act. It was less about correcting a boy's curiosity and more about enacting humiliation on a rival house. The pensive showed Harry his father's cruelty. The punishment showed him Snape's. Together they formed a lesson not about rules, but about the blurred boundaries between personal wounds and institutional power. In that tangled moment, Gryffindor paid for Harry's curiosity, and Hogwarts revealed once more that justice there was as complex and as flawed as the people who wielded it. Number 23. Hermione and the Unpermitted Answers. Hermione Granger's eagerness to answer questions in class is one of her most defining traits, but within the dark and oppressive atmosphere of Professor Severus Snape's dungeon classroom, this enthusiasm often turned into a liability. Readers will recall how she perpetually raised her hand, almost vibrating with the desire to supply an answer. Yet Snape's disdain for Gryffindors and perhaps for Hermione herself created a hostile environment where correct answers did not always win respect. Instead, on at least one memorable occasion, her knowledge brought punishment. The incident is both peculiar and telling. Snape deducted points from Gryffindor because Hermione dared to answer without permission, branding her display of intellect as insufferable self-importance. As this odd case reveals much about double standards in the Hogwarts system, the scene took place during one of the early potions lessons in Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. Hermione, unable to restrain herself, called out the answer when Snape interrogated Harry about ingredients. Harry, unprepared for the hostility directed at him, stumbled over the questions. Yet Hermione, who had devoured her textbooks long before setting foot in Hogwarts, supplied the correct information. Instead of recognizing her preparation, Snape sneered. The words are etched in the memory of every attentive reader. For your information, Potter, asphodel, and wormwood make a sleeping potion so powerful it is known as the draught of living death. A bezoar is a stone taken from the stomach of a goat, and it will save you from most poisons. And monkshood and wolfsbane are the same plant, which also goes by the name of aconite. The remarkable fact is that Harry did not say any of this. Hermione whispered it at first, and then said it more audibly when Snape ignored her raised hand. Her enthusiasm, however, brought no reward. Instead of acknowledging Hermione's readiness, Snape turned the moment into a humiliation for Harry. But the additional sting came when he punished Gryffindor as a whole. Snape declared that Gryffindors should learn not to shout out answers, and promptly removed points. It is a strange disciplinary choice because other professors at Hogwarts handled interruptions differently. In Professor McGonagall's Transfiguration class, for example, while strict, she rarely removed points for a student blurting out an answer. At worst, she delivered a sharp reprimand. Even in Professor Flitwick's charms lessons, the occasional enthusiastic outburst did not result in faculty punishment. Yet when the action came from Hermione in Snape's dungeon, the response was swift and severe. The imbalance becomes clearer when one considers that other houses did not face such penalties. Slytherins, in particular, seemed to enjoy a measure of immunity. When Draco Malfoy boasted or interrupted, there was rarely a subtraction of points. On the contrary, Snape often awarded Slytherins for behavior that mirrored the exact same qualities he condemned in Gryffindors. This inconsistency is not accidental. Rowling carefully constructed Snape as a character riddled with bitterness and favoritism, so moments such as this reveal his character more than the rules of Hogwarts. The punishment of Hermione for answering without permission is therefore a tool to expose Snape's bias. From a narrative perspective, the removal of points in this instance also carries symbolic weight. Gryffindor, the House of Courage, is constantly undermined by the authority of the potion's master, who channels his resentment of Harry's father into every interaction with the boy and his friends. Hermione's knowledge, instead of being celebrated, is twisted into another weapon against Gryffindor's standing in the House Cup competition. For a young reader, it creates frustration. Why should a student be punished for being prepared? Why should accuracy be treated as arrogance? And why, most importantly, should one house bear the brunt of discipline while others are excused? The injustice resonates particularly because Hermione is not arrogant in the way Snape suggests. Her eagerness often borders on impatience, but it is born out of genuine passion for learning. In Philosopher's Stone, she is 11 years old, desperate to prove herself, and keenly aware that her Muggle-born background sets her apart. By mastering spells and memorizing facts, she seeks to secure a place in the wizarding world. When Snape penalizes her house for her answers, he is not simply controlling classroom behavior, he is undermining her very effort to belong. Readers sense the cruelty behind this, and it is one of many small injustices that accumulate throughout the story. The choice of words Snape used is also revealing. Insufferable know-it-all became a label Hermione carried throughout her school years, repeated by peers and rivals. Yet it is ironic that knowledge, in a school dedicated to magical education, was condemned as insufferable. In that first potions lesson, the punishment sent a message. Brilliance is unwelcome unless it aligns with the teacher's bias. This creates an unsettling atmosphere where fairness does not exist, and where students quickly learn that rules are applied unevenly. What makes this case more striking is that points were deducted from Gryffindor, not from Hermione individually. At Hogwarts, the system of awarding and removing points was meant to foster collective responsibility. Yet, punishing an entire house for one student's behavior raises questions about whether the system is just at all. Why should Harry, Ron, and every other Gryffindor suffer for Hermione's eagerness? Why should Neville lose points because Hermione answered correctly without raising her hand in the exact manner demanded? This collective penalty seems designed not to encourage discipline, but to breed resentment. It put pressure on students to regulate one another, and in the case of Gryffindor, it created additional tension within the trio during their first year. The selective enforcement of rules by Snape also sheds light on the broader culture of Hogwarts. Discipline was not standardized. Each professor acted according to personal style, leaving enormous room for inconsistency. In Snape's classroom, favoritism towards Slytherin was open and blatant. Professor McGonagall, strict as she was, at least sought fairness across houses. Professor Sprout fostered kindness and patience, while Flitwick maintained a cheerful encouragement. Only in Snape's dungeon did intellectual passion translate into disciplinary sanction. This inconsistency is what makes Hermione's case stand out. It is not simply about her answer, but about the values represented in each classroom. Snape's hostility toward Hermione specifically also plays a role. Beyond his resentment of Harry, Snape displayed a certain disdain for Muggleborns, even if he did not align himself openly with Voldemort's blood purity ideology. Hermione's brilliance threatened to expose his own hypocrisy, a half-blood who suffered ridicule himself, yet who projected cruelty onto others. By punishing her in front of the class, he asserted dominance while masking his insecurities. The unfair removal of points thus becomes both a personal jab and a reflection of his unresolved trauma. It is worth noting how these small injustices affected the trio's perception of authority. For Harry, it reinforced his mistrust of Snape, laying the groundwork for years of suspicion. For Ron, it cemented the belief that Gryffindors would always be unfairly targeted. For Hermione, it produced a conflict between her instinct to excel and the consequences of displaying her knowledge. Yet she never allowed the punishment to stop her from raising her hand again. This resilience is crucial to her character, but the initial unfairness marked her relationship with Snape for the rest of her education. From a literary angle, the episode also builds tension within the broader theme of justice and authority in the series. Hogwarts is presented as a school, yet it mirrors society with its flaws, hierarchies, and biases. The point system, far from being neutral, becomes a stage for professors to wield power according to personal prejudice. Hermione's punishment illustrates how authority can distort fairness, turning a classroom into a theatre of humiliation. It foreshadows the more severe abuses of authority that students would later encounter under Umbridge, reminding readers that injustice often begins with the small, overlooked moments. Fans often debate whether Snape's cruelty was justified by his suffering. Yet the potions class incident demonstrates how personal bitterness, when unchecked, corrodes fairness. It shows how children can be caught in the crossfire of adult grudges. Hermione's simple act of calling out an answer should have been celebrated, or at most gently corrected. Instead, it became ammunition in Snape's ongoing war against Gryffindor. The fact that this memory lingers so vividly in readers' minds proves how much weight Rowling placed on the episode. One must also remember the long-term irony. Years later, Hermione would brew complex potions herself, including polyjuice, with a skill rivaling that of professionals. Snape's dismissal of her early eagerness did not suppress her abilities, but only hardened her determination. Yet the scar of being punished for her brilliance remained, visible in her insecurity when mocked as a know-it-all by peers. That single removal of points was not just about numbers on a scoreboard, it was about shaping how a young witch viewed herself in the eyes of authority. This incident remains a small but powerful example of how double standards operated at Hogwarts. When a Slytherin interrupted, it was overlooked. When Hermione did the same, Gryffindor suffered. It reminds us that fairness in the wizarding world was never guaranteed, and that the fight against injustice often began within the walls of the castle itself. Readers who cheer for Gryffindor feel the sting of this punishment because it is not only Hermione who was reprimanded, but the very idea of courage, curiosity, and learning without fear. Number 24. Harry and Draco's duel. Under the dim candlelight of the great hall, when the desks and benches were pushed back and the floor was cleared for the makeshift duel, the scene carried all the weight of theatre. It was Draco Malfoy, with his drawling confidence, who first stepped forward and made the challenge. Harry Potter, still uncertain in his second year at Hogwarts, accepted because to refuse would have been an act of cowardice, a concession that Malfoy would have exploited for weeks. Yet, what unfolded that night in the Chamber of Secrets stands as one of the strangest moments in Hogwarts discipline. Though Draco was the provocateur, it was Gryffindor who paid the price, as points were removed from their house. The logic felt inverted. The boy who sparked the trouble slipped away unpunished, while Harry bore the brunt of collective blame. The duel itself was far from harmless. Malfoy's intention was never playful. He raised his wand with the intent to humiliate, to showcase Harry's supposed incompetence. When Snape stepped in to serve as Draco's second, the entire atmosphere shifted. There was nothing of fairness in the air, only the silent weight of favoritism. Professor Lockhart may have been the official overseer of the duel, but he was a caricature of authority, too obsessed with his own reflection to impose genuine control. Thus the rules bent in favour of Malfoy, and Harry found himself under attack in a situation that had never truly been his choice. Rowling writes, Malfoy raised his wand quickly. Serpensortia! A long black snake shot out of it, landed on the floor between them, and raised itself, ready to strike. That single moment marked how drastically the situation had escalated, far beyond the bounds of a school exercise. Harry's instinctive response to the snake revealed his character more than the duel itself. Speaking Parseltongue, he calmed the serpent before it could harm Justin Finch-Fletchley. Harry, it was an act of protection. To the crowd of students, it was shocking evidence that he was somehow aligned with dark magic. The misunderstanding that followed cast Harry not as a victim of Malfoy's provocation, but as a sinister participant. And yet the most jarring element is what came after. Instead of recognizing that Harry had been placed in danger by Malfoy's conjured serpent, the disciplinary outcome penalized Gryffindor. House points were removed, reinforcing the impression that whatever transpired, Gryffindor was destined to carry the stain. There is a peculiar injustice in this pattern. Malfoy was the instigator, armed with a spell designed not for defense but for menace. He stood with Snape's approval, and Snape, far from discouraging him, smirked as the snake slithered across the floor. Rowling notes that Snape's voice was sounding delighted as he encouraged Harry to let the snake attack. This was no neutral educator, but a biased authority figure enabling a favoured student. Yet no consequence befell Draco, no punishment was doled out to Slytherin House. Instead, Harry endured suspicion and whispers, and Gryffindor lost points once more, as if the narrative of Hogwarts discipline required them to be the perennial scapegoats. The duel had not been Harry's idea. He had not drawn his wand in challenge, nor sought confrontation. His every choice was reactive, to defend himself, to respond to Malfoy's aggression, to protect another student from harm. And yet, when the dust settled, it was his house that suffered. This is what makes the incident ni suraisni, clumsy and illogical in its handling. A school meant to instill fairness appeared instead to bend under biases and appearances. The Gryffindors were taught an unspoken lesson. Even when provoked, restraint would not shield them from blame. It is important to consider the role of teachers in this spectacle. Lockhart had organized the dueling club to showcase himself, not to teach genuine defense. He paired Harry and Draco because it promised drama, the two boys already locked in rivalry. The setup was less about instruction and more about entertainment. Snape's involvement ensured that the scales tipped, as he gave Draco instructions and smirked through Harry's struggle. When the snake appeared, Lockhart bungled his attempt to banish it, his incompetence making the threat worse. In that chaos, Harry acted with clarity. Yet when McGonagall and other staff reviewed events, the easy choice was made, to assign the fault to the Gryffindor boy who had spoken in the feared language of serpents. The wider student body absorbed the incident differently. They did not remember that Draco had conjured the snake. They remembered that Harry spoke to it in Parseltongue. They did not recall that Snape had stood silent while danger spread. They whispered that Harry might be the heir of Slytherin. Perception became reality, and perception was shaped by fear. Once more, Gryffindor as a house became associated with scandal. It is in this way that the duel carried consequences beyond a handful of points. It stained Harry's reputation, created distance between him and his peers, and fed into the larger narrative of suspicion surrounding him throughout the year. Looking back, one sees how the duel symbolized a recurring imbalance. Time and again, Malfoy provoked, sneered, or sabotaged, and time and again, Harry and his friends carried the penalties. Whether it was midnight escapades to protect others, confrontations in class, or acts of bravery mistaken for mischief, the punishment rarely touched Slytherin. In the duel, this inequity was heightened to absurdity. The boy who conjured the threat escaped unscathed. The boy who prevented harm was condemned. It is no wonder readers recall this scene with a sense of frustration. The quote, "You're a Parselmouth, why didn't you tell us?" spoken by Ron afterward, captures the bewilderment of Harry's allies. They could not understand why he never shared this ability. Harry himself had never considered it unusual, but in the world of Hogwarts, where history was steeped in prejudice, such an ability tainted him. Thus the duel not only cost points, but also isolated Harry socially. The punishment from the staff mirrored the whispers of the students. Suspicion fell heavier on him than on Malfoy. The duel became a turning point in perception, not simply a skirmish in the Great Hall. In examining fairness, one sees that Hogwarts discipline was less about justice and more about optics. To punish Draco might have drawn attention to the favoritism that shielded him. To punish Harry reinforced an existing suspicion and seemed, on the surface, consistent with events. But this was a distortion. For Gryffindor it meant a further erosion of their standing in the House Cup. For Harry it meant another burden to carry, proof that no matter his intentions, consequences would land on him. The duel was not a fair test of skill, but a trap disguised as one, with only one house ever meant to lose. The imbalance between Gryffindor and Slytherin was not incidental. Rowling crafted it to highlight the larger conflict. But within the narrative, it exposed the weaknesses of the Hogwarts system. Teachers allowed personal biases to dictate fairness. Students allowed fear to dictate judgment. Authority figures hid behind the easy choice, punishing the visible outcome rather than addressing the true cause. In such a structure, Gryffindor's role was predetermined. Even when they acted in defense, they bore the mark of misconduct. The duel was the clearest crystallization of this rule. Consider also the symbolic power of the snake. Malfoy intended it as a weapon, a demonstration of his control. But it turned into a mirror reflecting Harry's hidden connection to a darker legacy. The snake was not punished for appearing. Draco was not punished for summoning it. Harry was punished for speaking to it as though words were worse than the fangs that nearly struck. This inversion captures the illogic of the punishment. Danger was excused because it aligned with favoritism. Safety was condemned because it clashed with fear. Such was the nesurazny sluci of the duel. The duel did not vanish from memory after that night. It echoed in the following weeks as attacks on students multiplied. Each whisper of Parseltongue, each recollection of Harry's command to the snake reinforced the idea that he was dangerous. The punishment given to Gryffindor became one more stone in the wall separating Harry from the rest of the school. Thus, what began as Draco's attempt to humiliate became a burden that weighed entirely on Harry. The injustice was not limited to a score. It extended into suspicion, fear, and isolation. When reflecting on this moment, readers recognize the absurdity. It was Draco who provoked, Draco who conjured, Draco who stood ready to watch harm unfold, yet no consequence touched him. Gryffindor carried the mark of failure, their points reduced, their reputation tarnished. The duel stands as a testament to the imbalance of discipline at Hogwarts. It is remembered not for the spells cast, but for the injustice endured. In a world where provocation went unpunished and defense was condemned, Gryffindor was destined to pay, and Harry was destined to stand accused. Number 25, Luna and Her Oddities. Luna Lovegood's story within the world of Harry Potter is often overshadowed by the grand battles, prophecies, and the constant danger surrounding Harry himself. Yet her presence reveals something subtle but deeply unsettling about the way Hogwarts treated individuality. Luna was a Ravenclaw, intelligent in her own unconventional way, but she was mocked not only by students, but even dismissed by adults who were supposed to protect curiosity. One particular moment shines a light on this contradiction. She lost house points simply because her words were deemed silly. In a school that prided itself on learning and wisdom, the punishment of imagination seems almost absurd. It is here where the true paradox of Hogwarts appears, where individuality could be treated as distraction rather than celebrated as a different form of genius. The scene in which Luna was reprimanded might seem small compared to battles against Death Eaters or duels between rival students, yet it is emblematic of something larger. During a lesson in Care of Magical Creatures, Luna mentioned creatures that the rest of the wizarding world believed to be myths, such as the crumple-horned Snorkack. Instead of inspiring curiosity, her words irritated the instructor, who impatiently reminded her that these beings did not exist and marked her as disruptive. As the teacher's temper rose, the punishment was swift. House points were taken from Ravenclaw. This act was not just discipline, it was a dismissal of her right to express ideas that did not conform to accepted truth. The books show Luna's resilience, but this detail illustrates how even Hogwarts sometimes crushed the very qualities that made its students unique. The unfairness of this moment echoes a repeated pattern throughout the series, where Luna's peers often labelled her Loony Lovegood. The cruelty of children can be explained by immaturity, but when adults reinforced the same message by punishing her for eccentricity, the injustice became sharper. "You're just as sane as I am," she famously told Harry in Order of the Phoenix. That single line is both whimsical and tragic. It reminds us that Luna did not see herself as broken. She saw her openness to odd possibilities as sanity itself, and yet Hogwarts failed. To honor this perspective, taking points for her supposed nonsense was not just discipline, it was symbolic exclusion. What makes the situation even more ironic is that much of Luna's knowledge, ridiculed as fantasy, often contained kernels of truth. She might have been wrong about certain creatures, but she was right about Thestrals when Harry could not see them yet. Her insistence that there were hidden dimensions to the magical world turned out to be more accurate than many realized. The system of Hogwarts house points was meant to encourage discipline, respect, and cooperation. Yet here, it punished a girl for simply imagining. If Ravenclaw valued wit and wisdom, how could the school punish one of its members for a curious spirit? The contradiction is impossible to ignore. This raises a larger question about the culture of Hogwarts itself. Was the point system truly about rewarding merit, or was it about enforcing conformity? When Professor McGonagall removed points from Gryffindor, it was usually for genuine rule-breaking, When Snape punished Harry, it was often fueled by bias. But when Luna lost points for discussing imaginary creatures, the punishment sent a darker message that the system cared less about truth and more about order. Hogwarts, which claimed to be a sanctuary of learning, sometimes behaved like a machine designed to flatten individuality into obedience. The moment with Luna demonstrates this better than almost any other. The cruelty of the punishment is amplified by Luna's vulnerability. She had no parents in the school to defend her, no older siblings to protect her reputation, and very few friends. The narrative describes how her belongings were often stolen and hidden by other students. Against this backdrop, having her ideas mocked by a teacher and her house penalized only reinforced her isolation. In Order of the Phoenix, Harry noted how Luna seemed untouched by ridicule, but the quiet courage required to remain true to herself came at a cost. Every lost point was not just a number on a board, it was a public reminder that she was considered wrong by the authority of Hogwarts. We should remember, too, that imagination has always been the birthplace of magic in Rowling's world. The very invention of spells, charms, and magical theory depends on someone daring to think differently. Yet the teachers, who should have recognized this, punished Luna for living in that imaginative space. One could imagine Rowena Ravenclaw herself, the founder who valued wit beyond measure, looking at the scene with disappointment. Wasn't Luna exactly the kind of student her house was supposed to nurture? The stripping of points becomes almost symbolic of Ravenclaw's betrayal of its own ideals. This event also reveals a double standard in how Hogwarts treated its students. Fred and George Weasley disrupted classes constantly with pranks, explosions, and enchanted objects. While they sometimes lost points, they were also celebrated by students and even tolerated by some teachers. Harry himself broke rules frequently and yet was often forgiven because of the special circumstances surrounding him. Luna, by contrast, harmed no one. Her only offense was talking about things others could not see. And still she paid with public humiliation. The contrast is glaring. What is more damaging, fireworks in the corridors or a dreamy girl mentioning invisible creatures? The punishment also tells us something about the fragility of adult authority in Hogwarts. Teachers, overwhelmed by noisy classrooms and difficult students, could lash out unfairly. Instead of guiding Luna toward better ways of expressing her thoughts, the teacher chose to silence her. This reflects the weaknesses of the Hogwarts system. It relied on personal temperaments rather than consistent principles. Snape's favoritism towards Slytherin, Umbridge's sadistic punishments, or Binns's apathetic teaching, all reveal flaws in the institution. Luna's lost points fall into the same category, evidence that Hogwarts, though magical, was no utopia. What makes Luna's case so striking is that she never retaliated. She never tried to conform just to win approval. When her classmates mocked her jewelry made of radishes or her habit of reading the Quibbler upside down, she smiled with serenity. When she was punished for nonsense, she carried on speaking her truth. This resilience became one of her defining qualities, and it later proved essential when she stood beside Harry in the Department of Mysteries. Her imagination, once mocked, became courage. She was willing to believe in the unbelievable, to follow Harry into danger, because she had long trained her mind to accept what others refused to see. Her punishment also foreshadowed the greater theme of the books, the danger of dismissing uncomfortable truths. When Harry claimed Voldemort had returned, the wizarding world ridiculed him much like they ridiculed Luna. The Ministry punished him, Umbridge silenced him, and even friends doubted him. In this sense, Luna's earlier treatment was a mirror of what Harry would endure. She embodied the idea that truth is not always comfortable, and those who speak it often pay a price. Her lost house points were a miniature version of Harry's struggle against disbelief and denial.